The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier, minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. The party has begun.
Okay.
Party.
Little party. Party time.
Roaring, roaring, roaring.
20s.
Okay.
Prodigality.
That's a great word.
Yeah.
Great word.
And that great word comes from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's capturing not just the party, but kind of a mood, an atmosphere, really just a decade that felt electric, unstable, dazzling, and maybe a little bit reckless.
A little bit reckless, yeah. So the 1920s weren't just loud, they were transformative. And after the unfortunate trauma of World War I and the unfortunate 1918 influenza pandemic, a lot going on, Americans were ready for something new. They were ready for new technology, new culture, new identities, and maybe new rules. Dua Lipa, new rules.
Okay.
That's a good
One,
reference.
don't pick up the phone, you know.
What?
That's a song, New Rules by Dua Lipa.
I don't know that
Get
song.
hit.
Okay, but there's a twist to all of this because for every flapper that's doing the Charleston, you know, there's some kind of preacher warning about the moral collapse of society. And for every Harlem poet celebrating Black Pride, there's a lawmaker attempting to restrict immigration. So what we have here is really the 1920s as a story of acceleration, but also reaction.
So today, we're dividing. We're not dividing at all. We're diving.
Sure.
We're diving into a new economy, cultural revolution, some racial creativity, some political conservatism, and the tensions that set up the Great Depression. Let's step into the jazz age.
And as we do that, we're going to keep one idea in front of us the whole time. The 1920s wasn't just one America. I think maybe we look back nostalgically on the 20s as being one thing, but it's multiple Americas. It's urban and rural, it's immigrant and native-born, it's white and black, it's modernist and fundamentalist, arguing over what the country even was.
And this really kind of sums up why the decade, the Roaring Twenties, is everywhere and why it's so often referenced in literature, in debates, in Supreme Court cases, and really modern society, modern culture goes back to this moment where a conversation about whether or not America is a place of liberal expansion or if it's more about conservative reaction. Ultimately, what we get here is the fact that Americans still are arguing about these questions of money, morality, and who belongs.
So grab your fedora, respectfully, and let's start where the decade really begins, with a new kind of economy and a new kind of everyday life.
You know, a lot of decades matter. We talk about a lot of different decades.
We do, especially when we get to the 20th century.
Right. I guess in the 19th century, it's really the 1850s. That's a big decade. But other than that, we don't really...
You say that because you're an antebellum historian.
Yeah, but we talk about... Yeah, okay.
I don't think most people would say 1850s.
Oh, I don't know. 1850s. Crazy.
I think a lot of people would say 1860s with the Civil War.
Yeah. Okay, the point is that...
Actually, I don't think anyone looks at the 19th century and says, let me pick a decade.
No.
Let me pick a decade.
I think 1900. Actually, that's a trend right now on TikTok is what decade resembles what holiday.
What?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So, for example, I think the video I saw said 1950s is Easter. And I said 1940s to me feels like, well, no, let's go. I said 1970s felt like Arbor Day.
Okay, that
Creation
tracks.
of the EPA and environmentalism
okay.
and stuff,
I see
you know?
it. Why the 50s Easter?
I don't, it's just the vibe that the 50s gives to me.
That's
Do you
dumb.
guys have one? I mean,
No, that's stupid.
I do something.
Okay, here's okay, they said 1920s would be New Year's Eve.
Okay, that
that make
tracks
sense
too.
to you now?
I just threw me off when you said about the 50s and Easter. I was like trying
That's
to
just
figure
I
out
think
the
maybe the
connection.
pastels and stuff. And just kind of I don't know.
Pastel.
I don't know, but
Okay.
whatever.
Okay.
All of this-
That's a trend right now is what I'm saying. But yeah, I don't think anyone looks to any other century and says, what's your favorite decade?
Yeah. Okay. All of that to say that we tend to look back on the 1920s as a decade, right? It matters and it stands out because it feels like so much happened and changed during this time period. Communication gets super fast. We start making things like crazy. And it's really maybe more than anything, culture starts to become this fast-moving train.
And because of that culture, I think that's why it's a decade that's very easy to visualize for people. And I now that I'm reflecting on this, I think because it's the first decade that we call it by its number, the 20s.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we don't do that with the teens or
No.
you know the.
Right. If you think about any other prior decade, we
This
don't
is
refer
the first
to it
one.
that way. Yeah.
So it's easy to visualize because you think of jazz clubs and radios and Model Ts, and that's my dream one day is to own an original Ford Model T, and the first baseball heroes and speakeasies and movie palaces for the first time. But what makes it historically important is not the visuals, it's not the outfits.
Right. It's that the 20s is where you can see our country becoming a modern mass society, mass production, mass media, mass consumption, plus anxiety, mass anxiety.
Mass.
Let's go to mass.
Right. And at the
hope
start of the decade, you kind of get a symbol for how contradictory it's all going to be. Because as the nation is expanding democracy with women's suffrage, at the same time, there's all these efforts to try to police the behavior. You get prohibition, the most prohibitive of actions taken to try to limit and create a sort of social control. But when all these limits come into place, we also see debates about who actually is allowed to come into the country at all.
Yeah, so it's very we're getting two contradictory things here, right? That some people are feeling this sense of liberation in the 20s, but also limitation, and that's what we have, two things side by side.
Yeah. So the modern emerging kind of like coming up against the traditional way. So let's talk about the economy because that's
the economy, stupid.
It's you got to say it like James Carville would, kind of with that kind of twang. Like,
Yeah.
It's the economy, stupid.
Oh, that's good.
Let's talk about the economy, stupid, because that's the engine under the hood, baby.
And we know that after a rough post-war adjustment, after World War I, the United States has to figure out, okay, how do we continue this expansion? The United States finds a way to enter this long period of growth. We've got factories becoming more and more efficient. Companies just keep getting bigger and bigger. And for millions of Americans, life becomes very consumer-oriented.
And that's the key shift, that the economy now, it's not just about producing goods like it has been in the past, but it's about creating customers. And it is about courting those customers and convincing them that they need things that they didn't even know existed.
Right. And this is where advertising really becomes its own kind of power. It's not only describing products, it's selling a whole new lifestyle. You're not buying a radio, you're buying the modern way.
And affordability kind of follows along suit. You've got Henry Ford's assembly line creating a new industrial standard so that cars become dramatically cheaper over time. And that's going to transform really everything, commuting times, picking up dates.
Yeah, now couples have a private place to hang out that moves.
And people start moving out to the burbs because they can live now further away from their places of work. It's easier to go on vacation. And teenagers start to create this whole
those
cult
teenagers.
of cars.
And here's the sneaky part, right? That a lot of this prosperity is running on credit. And the reason that new consumers can be gathered by these companies is because you don't have to be able to afford these things immediately anymore. That you can buy these things on installment plans, which makes availability much more widespread, especially for cars. And so in a 1930 report on credit buying said that by the mid-20s, roughly 3/4 of cars were sold on payment plans.
Dang! So basically the 1920s invents the concept of monthly payments.
Right. And I think our listeners might say to themselves, well, that's how everybody buys cars, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's very hard to pay attention right now because if any of our listeners know Dr. Kaup, she is really trying to distract us right now.
She's
Right.
pulling a lot of faces, and man, some of them are pretty funny.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we just said, I'm going to pull us all back together.
Pull us all back together.
We just said that huge percentage of people are buying cars on credit, but we might have a lot of listeners who are saying, yeah, but that's how everybody buys cars today. What's so crazy about that? You've got to remember that there were no restrictions on this. There was no regulations. Today, if you need a car loan, there's all these
Background
boxes that
checks and
you
how
can't
much
just-
credit is available to you based on
Exactly.
your income. Yeah.
But
And
back
so
then, nah, it was wide open. Anybody could get credit to buy just about anything they wanted. And the danger is that credit can make prosperity look broader than it is. You can have a shiny car in the driveway, but actually, financially, be in a lot of trouble.
TBD. TBD and no, I didn't want to say TBD. Not to be determined. I wanted to say
TBH?
no. I
To
wanted
be
to say
honest?
like stay tuned in.
Oh.
Like
So you could just probably say, stay tuned in.
yeah. I thought there in my seminar day we were talking about acronyms and I thought there was an acronym like I don't know.
To be determined?
Yeah, just like wait.
Yeah.
Just wait for the economy to turn. That's all I was going to say. All right. I don't want to do a sad song for our transition. We're going to do something happy.
go.
Cheerful coming at you.
You know, the music that you chose
Yeah.
kind of aligns with the pace of the 1920s.
It does.
It's like dun 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 dun. It's like you're breakneck speed. You know, you're like wow. You're consuming everything. So if this decade was so prosperous, and it appeared to be, why is labor so tensed up about it?
Right, and it's because in the 1920s, it's an era of corporations growing incredibly powerful, kind of pushing back against the progressive era of reform. Corporations say, no, we've got to go, and that means we need to push back against unions, we need to push back against regulations. After the Red Scare years, unions had kind of been labeled as radical and dangerous, and employers even promote this idea of open shop, meaning, look, workers don't have to join a union. Instead, we've kind of have everything open out on the table. And there's this real push to try to delegitimize the American unions.
And some employers also try a softer approach. They think about new benefits that they could add, pensions, even company picnics. Hey, let's all get together and
who
let's
doesn't like a company picnic?
yeah, let's improve morale. And that's what historians call welfare capitalism. It's like don't unionize because we're going to take care of you, but the company is still the one holding all the power.
You want a higher salary, but no. But look, here's a cookie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I like. Who doesn't like a good cookie?
That is really similar to our profession.
right. Here's a cookie, and then like
Hey, it's
Box of pretzels.
yeah.
you
Here's
give
here's pretzels. Thanks for all you do.
if you give a teacher a cookie, so you get this weird tension, right? That was entirely
Hey, we know we just keeping
appropriate.
adding more and more and more and more onto you, but these pretzels should do the trick.
These pretzels. It's National
I should
Pretzel
stop.
Day. Here you go. Okay. So you get this weird tension. Wages can rise in some sectors, and then hours can drop in some workplaces. But workers are losing their bargaining power overall, and union membership starts to decline across the decade.
This is going to set the stage for one of the most important labor stories of the decade because the new economy is relying on labor that's it's kind of treating as invisible.
And yes, I wasn't prepared for me to talk, but yes. So let's talk about a very important labor union from this time period that has to do with trains. And if you rode a train in the early 20th century, especially very long distance, there was a good chance that the person serving you in your train car was a black Pullman porter.
Right. And they worked long hours, and they depended on tips, and they dealt with racism from passengers and management. And for years, organizing was extremely difficult for them.
Right. So then A. Philip Randolph steps in. And in 1925, he becomes a founding leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And this is a major milestone because it's a black-led union. It's trying to crack one of the most powerful corporations in the country.
And we should add that a Pullman, right? A Pullman is a type of car, a type of railroad car at this time, and so these workers would have been, like we said, serving people, helping with luggage, and Philip Randolph, the leader of this Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, his language is really striking because it connects the labor struggle to a broader freedom struggle. And the U.S. Department of Labor preserves one of his most famous lines, and it reads this: "Freedom is never granted, it is won. Justice is never given, it is exacted."
Ooh. And that is not just a union slogan. That is a political philosophy.
It's foreshadowing, really, of the mid-century civil rights movement to come, and Randolph will be a major architect of that later activism. But it all kind of starts, as we keep saying, in the 20s, because the 20s is when the economy becomes modern, but racial hierarchy is still brutally old and firmly entrenched.
All right. Let's leave the city for a second because that's where all the action is in the 20s, right? Because one of the biggest misconceptions is that everyone is thriving.
And farmers, they're going to enter the 1920s already in trouble. You know, during World War I, the demand for American crops skyrocketed because the fields of Europe were torn apart. And so U.S. farmers expanded their production, but they often had to do this by borrowing money to buy more acreage and new technological equipment.
So when the war ends, European agriculture recovers pretty quickly, and global supply increases, which mean when supply increases and it outpaces demand, prices are going to fall.
And one Federal Reserve study summarizes this shock for farmers. By the 20s, farm incomes had fallen dramatically from their 1919 peak into the early 20s. And so it was really an agricultural depression inside this national boom in every other industry.
Right. So imagine the psychology here. You're told that the country is prosperous, Wall Street is partying, radio is booming, and at the same time you're watching neighbors lose farms.
That rural distress matters because it's going to continue to feed resentment, harkening back to the populism that we discussed a couple episodes ago. That doesn't just go away. It's
connection.
Continuity. Is that what we?
Oh, yeah, continuity. Last week.
Oh,
Did you listen to our episode from last week?
I haven't.
Oh, no.
Nice.
Wow.
Cool.
I'm sorry.
Cool.
I'm
Well, you had to drive
sorry.
back from Chicago. You could have listened to it, but whatever.
I could've.
So we're
Yeah, I
now
could've.
using the chime button when there's a continuity.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love that.
Try it again, and then do your
Continuity.
perfect. So we've got a nice little continuity here. Populism.
Wait,
does-
I'm going to need a change button too.
Change in continuity.
Change.
Wow,
Ooh, that's
that
good,
is.
yeah.
That's like you're ripping it off of something else. And okay.
That's
Alrighty.
good.
Wow.
So the continuity here is that in the 1880s and 90s, populism represented farmers' anger towards banks and big corporations and the government's unwillingness to step in to aid farmers in desperate times. And once again, here in the 1920s, farmers are angry. They're angry at banks that were lending out money and then kind of taking their farms away from them. They're angry toward the government that's unwilling to step in. It seems like culture is passing them by, and all of a sudden, it feels like Midwestern farmers are the only ones that weren't invited to the party.
Well, and they sure weren't invited to the party because they're not in the cities. And that's where we want to go back to because the 1920s creates something very powerful, a truly national mass culture. Change alert.
What's the
Wow,
change?
that is
Mass
abrupt.
culture.
Yeah.
Previously, you have culture regionally or even locally, but the idea of I want you kids, listen up. I want you to think about TikTok. You're seeing the same TikToks that kids all over the country are seeing. That starts now in the 20s.
Yeah.
That's a good way to phrase it.
That is good. Yeah, and radio.
Radio is
Oh.
the TikTok.
Oh, radio
Yes.
is the TikTok. That's the big one, baby. By the end of the decade, the Library of Congress estimates that 40% of American families owned radios.
And as Ms. Keltner was just saying, this is going to create a new form of politics, a new culture, because everybody could listen to a presidential address. Everyone could listen to the latest news. Everyone could share in the same cultural changes that are happening, and they just had to sit in their living rooms.
I'm looking up the top 100 songs from the 20s. One is called St. Louis Blues from 1925.
Yeah, that's a famous one.
Yep.
Okay. That's good to know.
You know, a great 1920 song, Makin' Whoopee.
Making whoopee.
You heard of that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sports, music, comedy, radio. These things, they become, or the radio and all these things on it, this becomes the national campfire.
Yeah, everybody gather around because we're going to listen to something important. We're going to be entertained. We're going to be informed, whatever. And you know what radio also becomes?
Oh, no.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you tired of walking like it's the 19th century? Introducing the 1920s miracle, the automobile. Why merely arrive when you can arrive in style?
Yeah, I mean, radio brings advertisements, and advertisements encourage people to spend more money. And so we kind of see again that the 1920s are about going fast, spending money, living the life, living the dream. So this advertisement's really actually not that far off from the attitudes.
Yeah, and movies are doing the same thing visually. Hollywood exports American stories across the country and eventually across the world. And I once met a Canadian in Ireland, and he told me the greatest export of America is its culture.
Oh, wow.
True story. And
I thought it was a beginning of a joke. Huh?
No, I said that's so true, and it starts now.
Yeah, 1920s is when the golden age of Hollywood begins, and it really starts with 1927's The Jazz Singers, one of the first talkies where you had sound, right? You didn't have silent film anymore. The Library of Congress's film preservation materials trace how the movie and the movie industry rapidly shift toward this new synchronized sound that everyone in a mass consumer way can engage in.
Right. But also the Jazz Singer shows the decade's contradictions because it includes blackface performance, reminding us that popular culture can be innovative but still really deeply racist.
And that's the 1920s in a nutshell, right? That it's modern on the surface, that it's progressive on the surface, but it's very messy underneath.
We should also, we're talking about modern society and changes, we're going to have to talk about gender because the 20s become the decade that maybe is most synonymous with a changing culture for women.
Change! So
I'm not going to use to that.
The flapper image that we are all so familiar with the 20s, we've got shorter skirts and dresses, bobbed hair, jazz clubs. You know, the flapper image, she becomes a cultural icon. And of course, not every woman lived that way. Actually, the majority of women did not live that way. But the symbol really matters because it represents youthfulness and independence and this public-facing feminine.
That's a
Oh
good
my.
one. That's a
Femininity.
tough one. You nailed it, but that's a tough one, you know? And it also, it scares people a lot.
And it scares people a lot in the creepy way that you said that.
Because I like being scared sometimes.
It scares
I think it's good to
older
be
people
scared
quite a
sometimes.
lot.
It scares the olds.
The olds.
Yep.
Because you've got all this cultural changes and you have all this activism. Even topics like birth control become up for grabs.
Dang,
Yeah,
that's
and-
like 100 years ago.
Yeah, and a woman named Margaret Sanger is central here. In her book, Woman and the New Race from 1922, she wrote, quote, "No woman can call herself free who does not own and control her body."
Wow, that sounds unbelievably prescient and familiar in today's terms. But so whether you agree with Sanger or not, the point is this. The 1920s pushes debates about women's autonomy into the mainstream.
But at the same time, women are still dealing with things like wage gaps and job segregation and the cultural expectations about marriage and motherhood. These are real discussions that don't just disappear in the 1920s.
So again, change and continuity,
Yes.
expanded rights, and persistent limits.
I feel like the change is negative, pejorative, and continuity is positive, the way we've set it up with noises.
No, I
do
think-
like the difference in the noises,
I
however.
think that I just want the change sound to be like
Arresting.
very aware.
Abrupt.
Yeah, abrupt. And just, this is a huge
Yeah.
change.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I totally get it. It makes sense to me.
Something's going outside our window. Is
Oh,
it Dr.
boy.
Kaup or?
Yeah, who knows?
Oh,
I don't know.
You know
it's
what?
probably Kaup's phone ring. Oh, it's Kaup's phone ringing, I bet.
We're safely ensconced in our studio. So let's flip the mood here, because Fitzgerald isn't the only voice of the decade.
Right, there's going to be a lot of artists and writers and painters who want to try to capture some of the disillusion that they felt after the horrors of World War I. They saw the war as proof that progress could produce actually this mass slaughter, and that materialism that started to emerge, they questioned it, and the idea that money equals meaning became dangerous to them.
And these are people of the lost generation. You know, this defining moment of people who lived through World War I and felt that just so many things had been lost. And the defining voice of this generation is Ernest Hemingway. Of course,
Have you heard of him,
I have
Dr.
to bring
Gerson?
that up.
Okay.
Big fan. Of course, In the Sun Also Rises, my favorite novel.
Did you read it or did you listen to it?
I don't listen to books. I don't think
You're above that.
I don't think people who listen to books really are readers. I don't want to offend anybody. But just
I really don't listen to that many books. I read a lot. I read more books.
Okay, so one of his most famous books, The Sun Also Rises, he has a character that says, quote, "You can't get away from yourself by moving from one place to another," even though, ironically,
I'm glad you took that advice.
that's what he basically did.
Yeah, well, but it's pretty true, and that's a pretty brutal line. It's kind of a cool one. What it does, it punctures the fantasy that if you just go somewhere else, buy something else, become someone else, you're going to feel whole, and that's really not the message here.
Well, and that's very reflective of the culture that's, the consumer culture that's running alongside all of this, right? That while some Americans are thrilled by the new world of stuff from this modern period, others are warning that it's very hollow.
Sinclair Lewis does something similar, but this time through satire, skewering this idea of boosterism and middle-class conformity of the prosperous 1920s. And the decade's literature becomes a debate over what the American dream actually is and should be.
And speaking of the American dream, we, in all of this culture, we've got to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, right?
To.
Because it's one of the most significant cultural moments in U.S. history.
It's closely tied to a topic we covered last episode, the Great Migration. And the National Archives describes the Great Migration as one of the largest internal movements in U.S. history because about 6 million Black Americans relocate from the South and the Jim Crow South to the North, the Midwest, and the Far West over the 20th century.
And by 1930, the Library of Congress notes that as many as 2 million African Americans had moved from the South to northern cities in the early decades, transforming places like Chicago and Detroit and New York.
And so Harlem, New York becomes the cultural capital of this movement through poetry and novels and theater, music, art, and journalism.
Langston Hughes, a member of this Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, captures the hope and insistence of the era in his poem, I, Too. In a brief excerpt, he says, "I, too, sing America. Tomorrow I'll be at the table."
And that's not just beauty, that's a claim to the sense of belonging.
In the Harlem Renaissance, it's not just about entertaining, right? It's about reshaping identity, claiming identity, demanding recognition, and challenging stereotypes.
It's also complicated, though, because Harlem nightlife draws white audiences, and you have Black artists sometimes finding opportunity through white patronage. So still facing segregation and racism, but also benefiting from white consumerism. So the cultural flowering that happens inside the nation is also seeing the growth, paradoxically, of groups like the KKK and anti-immigration groups that want to preserve a certain America.
Which brings us to the decade's backlash. So how does the United States respond to rapid cultural change?
One answer: Prohibition.
That's the only answer, baby.
Prohibition. Geez. So national prohibition begins on January 17th, 1920 with the passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act of Enforcement, which takes effect.
And it's important to understand Prohibition's supporters, right? In Prohibition, we have a continuity because this has been going on for a long time, since the 1800s and through the temperance movement, right? And so many of these supporters, like in the 1800s, now in the 1900s, they believe that alcohol contributed to domestic abuse, poverty, and public disorder, and they saw this as a moral and social reform.
But, you know, in practice, prohibition, what it does is like everybody's going to find a way to drink anyway. So it's really a gift to organized crime and bootlegging.
But it also becomes a cultural battleground because it really divides rural and Protestant, dry America from urban, immigrant-heavy, wet America.
And prohibition is not only about alcohol, it's about whose culture gets to define what it means to be American.
Also, it creates the most dramatic sentence in the American nightlife history, and that is, what's the password?
And if you get it wrong,
You're not getting in. You might get arrested.
you ain't getting in the speakeasy.
You ain't getting in.
Those speakeasies, they're kind of back in vogue now.
They are.
Yeah,
Everybody wants to go to a speakeasy.
it's fun.
Yeah. So prohibition, of course, is not the only answer to this cultural change. Another change and reaction, but also continuity, is immigration restriction. Continuity.
Yep, continuity. But can you also do the change? There's a change, too.
There's a change as well.
The change.
It's so nuanced and complex. Oh my gosh, that's what this whole course wants you to get it from it, that it's both.
Yes.
Yes, and the change here is that with the exception of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, in 1924, for the first time, the United States will pass legislation that explicitly limits immigration. It's the Johnson-Reed Act or the National Origins Act that creates a quota system. And the State Department's historical summary explains that it set quotas tied to the 1890 census and completely excludes immigrants from Asia.
So choosing that census, it's pretty clear what the intention was, and that is reducing immigration from specifically Southern and Eastern Europe and preserving an older ethnic makeup.
And I just want to clarify before we get complaints in our DMs that the first quota system was in 1921, built upon the 1910 census, but then the 1924 Act went back to the 1890 census to limit immigration even more. So sometimes we get a lot of hate in our DMs, and I just want to actually we never do. We get a lot of love in our DMs.
Wait,
yeah,
we do?
no,
think
no.
we've ever
Just want to cover our bases. I just want to cover our bases.
Okay.
Yeah. So about this.
Right?
About this this immigration makeup, the U.S. House Historian's Office preserves the bluntness of this debate. Representative Albert Johnson at the time argued during the discussion of this quota bill, it has become necessary that the United States cease to become an asylum.
And once again, here is nativism rearing its ugly head, saying, "Look, only certain type of people belong here, and those on the outside, they just don't have a place."
And these effects, they last for decades, right? The Migration Policy Institute notes that this law shaped the U.S. population by heavily favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe while shutting out many others, including people who would later be fleeing fascism and persecution.
And, of course, then there's the KKK.
In the 1920s, the Klan, it kind of moves beyond the South. It becomes more than just a Southern organization, and it really becomes something of a national mass movement.
And the Second Klan, it's more of a mainstream political force in the 20s with membership in the millions. I think by the end of the decade, there were 4 million members of the Klan. And this is all fueled by fear of immigration, urbanization, women's changing roles, and Black migration.
Right. And it doesn't just target African Americans, but also Catholics and Jews and immigrants. Basically anyone that they frame as being un-American.
So it's a reminder that backlash doesn't always look like just sort of disapproval or scowls, but sometimes it looks like mass mobilization to push back against a very mass changes that we were describing earlier.
Yeah, and more backlash and talk about, cultural conflicts. One of the most famous cultural flashpoints of the decade, the Scopes Monkey trial.
Love the Scopes monkey trial.
Love it.
In 1925, we got John Scopes, and he's prosecuted in Tennessee for teaching evolution. It's going to become a national media spectacle, though, because it's really a debate that breaks out over the law, religion, science, and just mass publicity all colliding together.
Can you guys imagine people being divided over what we teach?
Oh, no, that would never
Oh, that's
think
never
that'll
gonna-
ever
that would
happen.
never happen.
That happened 100 years ago.
That's weird. Yeah, and so and the press coverage, because here it is, we're in the 20s, right? It's pretty legendary, or it makes this court proceeding pretty legendary. Journalist H.L. Mencken, reporting from Little Dayton, Tennessee, warns readers not to treat it as harmless entertainment. Quote, "Let no one mistake it for comedy."
Because underneath this spectacle, and this trial absolutely was a spectacle, and everybody was tuned into it because of mass culture, a serious question is who controls knowledge, right? What counts as legitimate education, and what should each state enforce educationally?
And ultimately, the court case will go against the teacher, and it will kind of temporarily show that fundamentalism is very much alive. But
Well, I think, but also, he knew he was going to be guilty because
yeah.
he broke the law. He did teach evolution in Tennessee when he wasn't supposed to. But I think it was almost it had the opposite effect, that a lot of people saw this trial as grandstanding, as kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, it is a spectacle, but it brings to light these fissures that exist in American society in the 1920s, and it creates this question that echoes. And really, in every era, America continues to argue about what happens at schools, because schools are where society decides what it wants its future citizens to believe and how society wants them to behave.
Right. So culturally, things are pretty chaotic. So politically, what is the vibe?
Yeah, let's wrap up here by talking about the three presidents of the 1920s. Conservative, very business-friendly, pretty skeptical of the reform that came out of the 1890s and led to World War I. And they're all Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, that though they may differ in personality, they sort of share broad assumptions about markets being free and open, very limited government, and this idea that prosperity will trickle outward to the masses.
And Harding's going to campaign for the 1920 election on, quote, a return to normalcy, a promise to step away from all the progressive crusades of the early 1900s and 19-teens and from the wartime mobilization of World War I. And unfortunately, though, his administration also gets rocked by corruption, most famously the Teapot Dome scandal.
Oh.
So when Coolidge takes office after Harding's death and becomes the kind of symbol of pro-business government, in 1925 address, he says, quote, "After all, the chief business of the American people is business."
And that is not a throwaway line. That's a governing philosophy that you're going to see for the rest of the 20s.
And it pairs well with the policies that favor corporations and high earners throughout the 1920s. The Federal Reserve's historical profile of Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon notes that the top marginal tax rate fell from 73% in 1922 to 24% in 1929.
And then after that, you get Hoover, who's, remembered mainly for the Depression, but we're not there yet. In the 1920s, he's instead a major figure in commerce. He's seen as someone who's this standardizing force who creates cooperation between the government and big business.
And in his 1928 campaign, Hoover famously contrasts the idea of rugged individualism with what he calls European paternalism and state socialism. And that's a dig at Europe, that he's saying, over here, we're working hard. We're pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. We don't need help from the government.
Right. And this is an acknowledgement of Russia becoming the Soviet Union. That's the big thing that popped out into the open. So confidence in markets, confidence in business, confidence that America's system will keep delivering.
It's that confidence combined with some of the things we've talked about: consumer credit, mass speculation, uneven wealth distribution, and growing weaknesses in certain sectors, especially agriculture, that helps build the unstable foundation that makes an inevitable crash seems so devastating when it hits.
Yeah, and that word confidence is going to disappear by the 1930s. So this is why, the 1920s matters. It's not just a fun decade, but it's a setup.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll tell you all about what happens next on the next episode.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But thanks for tuning into this episode of A Push for All. And if you liked it, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or YouTube, and leave us a review. You got a topic you want us to cover, or you want to send us a nasty message, because we like
When we receive hate DMs, that's when we'll know we really made it.
Yeah, send those hate DMs to us at A Push for All on Instagram.
Come on, haters.
Until next time, haters, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.